Welcome to the Surgical Edge podcast for surgical insights, reviews, discussions, and to stay updated. Let's dive in.
Welcome to the show. Today we are speaking directly to you, the surgeons, the medical doctors, the specialists out there who are, making high-stakes decisions every single day.
You're the ones running the OR.
Exactly. The pressure, the precision, the immense weight of the outcomes. But today we're shining a light on a hidden variable that is quietly influencing almost every move you make in that space.
Right.
We are diving deep into defensive medicine.
And we really need to clarify right off the bat that we aren't just talking about the old cliche of, ordering a few extra lab tests to cover your bases. It goes so much deeper than that now.
It really does. The mission of this deep dive is to explore how liability pressures are actually steering the development of surgical technology itself.
Yeah.
We're going to look at how these pressures are completely altering hospital budgets and how they are fundamentally shaping the very tools you hold in your hands.
The actual hardware.
Right. And today's stack of sources includes some really fascinating empirical analyses on malpractice environments, qualitative work on surgical innovation, and comprehensive reviews on health systems. But before we begin, a quick disclaimer. This content is for reference only. Always follow local guidelines in your clinical practice.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's unpack this, because we really need to define what we're actually dealing with when we say defensive medicine in the modern era. What does that actually look like today?
It's so crucial to get the definition right, especially because the environment has changed so drastically. Defensive medicine essentially breaks down into two distinct behaviors. You have assurance and avoidance.
Right.
Assurance behaviors are those extra things you do to prove your thoroughness. It's ordering extra tests, using additional intraoperative tech, basically creating an airtight paper trail.
Just piling on the documentation.
Exactly. And then avoidance behaviors are the exact opposite. That's when you actively shun high-risk patients or step back from complex, novel procedures because the medical legal risk just feels way too high.
Like turning down a complex vascular case, not because it's inoperable, but because the statistical likelihood of a bad outcome.
And the resulting lawsuit.
Right. The lawsuit is just too heavily stacked against you.
Precisely. And what's really shifting the landscape today is that these behaviors are being radically amplified in an era dominated by AI, robotics, and incredibly advanced imaging.
Yeah.
It's no longer just about your day-to-day clinical decision-making. This fear is literally reshaping what technologies get developed in the first place.
How quickly they are adopted.
Right, and how fast surgical practice as a whole can evolve.
So if doctors are terrified of stepping out of line, how does that impact the companies actually making the tools? Because I'd assume innovation is all about finding the fastest, most effective cure.
You would think so.
But looking at the research, it sounds like there's a massive legal filter applied before a device even hits a blueprint.
What's fascinating here is what empirical analyses call the chilling effect. When you have an environment with high liability pressure, it heavily discourages medical device companies from developing.
And physicians from adopting.
Exactly. It discourages them from touching technologies that are truly disruptive. Even if a new device or a new technique might be clinically superior, if it's perceived as legally risky or overly complex, it just gets shelved.
Wait, so a company could have a prototype for something that genuinely improves patient survival, but the legal team kills it because it's too different from what's currently on the market.
That is exactly what happens. Law and economic scholars point out that courts rely heavily on customary practice.
The herd mentality.
Yes, think of it like the herd mentality. Courts aren't medical boards. They don't always understand cutting-edge biology or nascent surgical techniques. They understand the herd.
Right.
If you stay with the herd, if you follow customary practice, you're safe. Because of the fear of massive damages in malpractice suits, both companies and clinicians tend to favor low-risk, incremental modifications over true disruptive innovation.
You don't want to be the one holding the brand new unproven device when something goes wrong.
Never. If you invent a new path and stumble, the court hammers you.
But there's a flip side to this, right? The fear of malpractice doesn't just stop innovation. It actually stimulates a very specific, highly lucrative type of innovation. I like to think of it as assurance tech.
I like that term.
Right, because if doctors are terrified of being sued, innovators realize there's a massive market for building technology that manages that specific risk.
It's a huge market. An analysis of U.S. tort reforms found that the malpractice environment directly dictates medical device patenting. Companies are actively responding to your desire as a clinician to have tools that reduce technical errors, provide objective documentation, and simplify complex steps.
They know you're looking for armor.
They know you want armor.
The data gets really specific about where that R&D money is flowing to. It's being steered right toward technologies that reduce technical error. We're talking robotics, advanced navigation systems, and automated checklists.
Yeah.
It's flowing into devices that generate high-resolution data and images. And perhaps most importantly, it's going into systems that leave a crystal-clear, time-stamped documentary trail of appropriate care.
And we should be completely clear here, this isn't inherently a bad thing. Better monitoring, clearer imaging, and safer implants are genuinely great for patients.
Of course.
But it does mean that the innovation agenda is partially driven by perceived legal protection rather than being purely driven by patient-centered value.
Which is a big distinction.
It is. I want you, the listener, to think about the tools you use in the OR right now. Look at the screens, the navigation systems, the robotic consoles. Are they designed purely to give the patient a better outcome? Or are they partially designed to give you, the surgeon, an airtight legal defense if you're standing in front of a jury 5 years from now?
That is a staggering thought. The glowing screens in the OR aren't just monitors, they're legal shields.
Exactly.
And that brings us right to the individual surgeon's level, which the literature calls defensive adoption.
Yeah.
This is the doing everything possible trap.
Yes.
So what does this defensive adoption actually look like in the OR on a random Tuesday? Is it just ordering extra blood panels?
Far from it. It's much more systemic. The qualitative work on surgical innovation highlights how surgeons will often adopt new, incredibly expensive technologies despite limited evidence of improved outcomes.
Just to be safe.
And defensive motives heavily amplify this.
Because of that preemptive guilt. If you're a surgeon listening to this, you've probably felt that pressure. You know, the clinical guidelines say a certain piece of tech isn't strictly necessary for a straightforward case. But you also know that in a few years, an expert witness might sit on a stand and ask you why you didn't use it.
Exactly. That preemptive obligation is a heavy burden. Let's look at a concrete example, the robotic surgical platform. We see surgeons choosing $1 million robotic setup for a basic marginal indication that could easily be done with standard laparoscopy.
And they're doing that just because it looks state-of-the-art.
Yes. It is a lot harder for a plaintiff's attorney to claim you were negligent when you use the most expensive, advanced piece of tech in the building. It demonstrates extreme thoroughness.
Wow.
But it's not just the robot. Think about imaging. We see a huge uptick in ordering low-yield, high-end imaging, either preoperatively or postoperatively.
Just to avoid the dreaded missed pathology allegation, right?
Exactly.
If you scan everything, nobody can say you missed a 1 in a million anomaly.
Right. And then there's the use of intraoperative adjuncts, things like intraoperative neuromonitoring, CT angiograms, or complex navigation systems. Surgeons are utilizing these even when the evidence of their benefit for that specific routine case is incredibly weak.
Just to check the box.
It's all about proving that all options were utilized.
But there has to be a fallout from this.
Yeah.
You can't just throw $1 million machines and constant radiation at every patient without consequences.
The fallout is severe. First, you see rapidly escalating per-case costs without any proportional benefit to the patient. But worse than the financial cost, you're actually exposing patients to entirely new device-specific risks.
Right.
When you order unnecessary imaging defensively, you might be exposing that patient to contrast nephropathy or unnecessary radiation. When you use a robotic platform unnecessarily, you open the door to robotic platform failures, longer anesthesia times, and new complication profiles that wouldn't exist with a standard approach.
So what does this all mean? It seems to me we're creating a very dangerous, constantly moving standard of care.
We are.
By using these expensive gadgets defensively, surgeons inadvertently establish them as the norm. Suddenly, opting for a standard, perfectly effective traditional approach is framed as substandard care simply because the expensive gadget was omitted. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
It really is. And that perfectly sets up the exact opposite problem. We just talked about over-adopting out of fear. But defensive medicine also causes a massive innovation freeze through avoidance behaviors.
Well, other side of the coin.
This is when fear literally stops surgeons from innovating.
Right, stepping back. If a patient is incredibly high risk, the defensive instinct is to avoid the surgery. But the research shows this applies to the technology itself, too. Surgeons become incredibly reluctant to join first-in-human or early-phase trials.
Yeah.
And it makes sense. Why would a surgeon risk their license and their livelihood? The risk of a complication being judged harshly in a courtroom totally outweighs the potential breakthrough for the medical field.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, theoretical models of malpractice actually describe this dynamic explicitly. When a provider is forced to choose between a safe but less effective technology and a risky but more effective one, high liability pressure almost always pushes them toward the safer option.
They just won't take the bet.
They want to avoid that catastrophic complication at all costs, even if it means sacrificing a major potential benefit for the patient.
Can you give an example of what that trade-off looks like in practice?
Sure. In the surgical world, that might mean persisting with an open or conventional laparoscopic technique that you've done 1,000 times and actively avoiding a new biological implant or a novel navigation system.
Even if the new one is better.
The new implant might offer a faster recovery and better long-term function, but it has a steeper learning curve or uncertain failure modes. So you stick to the old way. You stay with the herd.
And the systemic impact of that is just devastating to progress. It completely chills the iterative refinement of surgical techniques. Surgery has always evolved by trying something, learning from it, tweaking it, and refining it.
Absolutely.
But if only a tiny handful of brave centers are willing to take on the legal risks of innovation, broader learning in the surgical field effectively grinds to a halt. The whole profession suffers because everyone is playing it legally safe.
The damage extends far beyond just the pace of innovation, too. It ripples out to the macro level of health systems and deeply impacts the next generation of surgeons. When we look at resource allocation, the reviews describe defensive medicine as a widespread driver of unnecessary hospitalizations, invasive procedures, and prolonged treatments.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because we have to talk about the budget distortion. Hospital budgets are finite. There's only so much money to go around.
Right.
When millions of dollars are devoured by purchasing legal reassurance gadgets and premium platforms whose marginal benefits are totally unproven, that money has to come from somewhere. It actively crowds out investments in low-cost, high-value innovations.
Exactly. Things like advanced simulation training centers for residents, comprehensive outcomes registries, or human factors redesign in the OR.
The stuff that actually saves lives.
These are the things that produce massive population-level gains in patient safety. But they offer far less obvious medico-legal shielding for the individual hospital or the individual surgeon, so they just don't get funded. The budget goes to the shiny new robot instead of the simulation lab.
And that lack of funding for training is compounded by the cultural impact on the trainees themselves. Imagine a third-year resident. They've grown up in an environment where ordering extra tests and using every available technological adjunct is constantly praised as prudent or thorough.
Yeah.
They're watching their senior attendings, their mentors, actively avoiding novel procedures or turning down complex cases purely out of fear of litigation.
That's a huge issue. The trainees are being socialized into a highly risk-averse culture from day one, and the research points out a very specific, dangerous outcome of this. Trainees are beginning to rely heavily on imaging and algorithms, which actively erodes their clinical reasoning and physical examination skills.
Because they just look at the screen.
They don't know what a normal physical exam looks like without a scan to back it up. They're learning to treat the scan and the legal chart rather than the patient sitting right in front of them.
It's treating the medical legal ghost in the room instead of the human being on the table.
I want to ask you, the listener, to really reflect on the trainees coming through your own hospital right now. Look at the residents and fellows you work with. Are we raising a generation of surgeons whose first question when faced with a complex case is, does this help the patient?
Right?
Or is their first instinct to ask, will this protect me? Because if the primary filter for technology assessment becomes self-preservation, the profession loses its capacity to critically evaluate what actually works.
That is a terrifying shift in the medical mindset. And it brings up the elephant in the room, the bidirectional relationship between modern technology and defensive medicine. Because as much as we've talked about technology being driven by fear, technology is actually both the problem and the solution here.
It really is a double-edged sword.
Let's start with the problem. The internet, smartphones, and the rapid expansion of medical tech capabilities have created a world of constantly rising patient expectations.
It's the dark side of the information age for a practicing physician. Patients walk in having Googled the most advanced robotic surgery available, expecting flawless, pain-free results.
They've done their own research.
They know about technologies that maybe your hospital doesn't even have yet. And every single new tool that gets invented anywhere in the world suddenly becomes a potential stick with which your care can be judged in court.
Right. The patient asks, why didn't you use the laser I read about on a blog?
Exactly.
But the literature also outlines how technology, if designed and governed correctly, can actually save the day and reduce this defensive practice. There seem to be three key pathways here. The first one is AI decision support, which sounds like a game changer.
It really is. Imagine AI-assisted systems embedded in your electronic health record that seamlessly integrate clinical guidelines, massive outcome data sets, and patient-specific risk profiles. These systems can support your evidence-based decisions in real time. If you have a dashboard that explicitly calculates that a CT scan is low value for this specific patient profile, it provides you with a rock-solid, auditable justification for explicitly skipping that test.
It documents the why.
It gives you the legal cover to do less when less is clinically appropriate.
That's huge, giving surgeons the data-backed confidence to say no to unnecessary interventions without feeling legally exposed.
Precisely. The second pathway is learning health systems. We're talking about high-quality registries and continuous feedback loops. Right now, uncertainty is a massive driver of defensive behavior.
Because you just don't know for sure.
If you aren't sure a new tech works, you might use it defensively anyway just to be safe. But robust registries clarify exactly where new surgical technologies genuinely improve outcomes and where they completely fail. It removes the guesswork.
It creates a baseline.
If the registry data proves a gadget doesn't help, it's much harder for a court to penalize you for not using it.
And the third pathway is data-aided informed consent. This is about changing the conversation before the patient ever hits the OR table.
Exactly. When you, as a surgeon, can sit down knee to knee with a patient and show them robust outcome statistics, when you can clearly and visually explain the trade-offs of a procedure using localized data, it drastically strengthens shared decision-making.
It gets everyone on the same page.
If a patient truly understands the data, the realistic outcomes, and the risks, it significantly reduces the likelihood of later allegations that a highly innovative or a highly conservative approach was inappropriate.
But the research is very clear that none of this tech utopia works without a massive shift in how we govern it.
True.
All the AI and registries in the world won't help if the legal system still punishes you for a bad outcome, which is why we need to talk about reclaiming the OR. What can surgeons and health systems actually do to ensure defensive medicine doesn't completely paralyze progress?
This raises an important question. How do we actually fix this deeply entrenched systemic issue? The literature provides several actionable takeaways. First, we have to evaluate innovation robustly. We need strict frameworks for the phased evaluation of new procedures and devices.
Not just adopting things on a whim.
By combining these frameworks with those transparent registries we just talked about, we can actually separate the true medical advances from the defensive gadgets. This gives surgeons a defensible, evidence-based foundation for their technological choices, rather than relying on marketing hype.
Second, we must align medical legal standards with actual evidence-based practice. This means advocating at a higher level for tort and regulatory reforms. We need a legal system that judges care based on whether it met reasonable evidence-based guidelines, not on whether every conceivable million-dollar gadget in the hospital was utilized during the procedure.
Yes.
We have to stop punishing clinicians when an adverse event occurs, despite them delivering perfectly guideline-concordant care.
Third, and this is so foundational, we have to rebuild trust and clinical reasoning. We need to emphasize time spent with patients, clear communication, and the absolute primacy of your clinical judgment.
Getting back to the basics.
Studies consistently show that a strong, empathetic patient-doctor relationship drastically reduces malpractice complaints. Technology should be there to augment your fundamental clinical skills, never to replace them.
And finally, we have to educate the trainees. We can't let that third-year resident grow up terrified of the courtroom. We need to explicitly teach the next generation about the economic and clinical consequences of defensive habits.
They need to understand the big picture.
Alongside teaching them how to critically appraise new technologies, we have to actively create a culture where they become tech-savvy, but not tech-driven.
That's the perfect way to phrase it. We want them to master the tools, but never let the tools master their clinical judgment or their courage.
To sum it all up, defensive medicine is far more than just a clinical headache or a few extra box checks on a chart. It is a massive, invisible force that fundamentally dictates industry R&D, drives hospital purchasing, and shapes surgical education.
It touches everything.
While liability pressures have undeniably spurred some valuable innovations focused on patient safety and documentation, they also encourage the massive overuse of high-tech solutions and actively inhibit transformative life-saving advances. The ultimate goal here is to consciously separate sound risk management from fear-driven practice.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, something that really builds on everything we've unpacked today. If the technological ecosystem of the modern operating room is, as we've seen, partially built on a foundation of legal fear and defensive posturing, what would a surgical suite designed purely for clinical courage and patient benefit look like?
That's a great question.
How would the tools change if the fear of litigation was entirely removed from the blueprint? And what is one small thing you can do tomorrow in your own practice or with your own trainees to start building it?
If you liked this deep dive, please do not forget to share it with at least one of your colleagues or friends and spread the word. Also, be sure to check out our YouTube and other social media pages.
Thank you for listening to the Surgical Edge podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Help us grow and deliver even more relevant surgical content by pressing the support button. Your contribution truly makes a difference. And don't forget to share with us your advice, feedback, and the topics you would like us to include.